We dreamt of something hard to do. We've done it. So green industrialization for me essentially means an opportunity to build new sustainable industrial clusters. We have some of the best solar irradiance in the world. At the same time, we have some of the best wind resources. You can use hydrogen to make clean fertilizer, shipping fuel, aviation fuel, and make a strategic input for clean steel.
James Mnup is Namibia's former presidential economic advisor and green hydrogen commissioner. He led one of Africa's most ambitious green industrialization efforts and continues that work today as head of Namibia's green hydrogen program.
What did it take to create such a bold proposal in the public sector?
A small hint of madness, a lot of vision, and of course, a very inspirational leader. That was one of the sweet spots where we got governments to...
Welcome, James. What does green industrialization mean to you, and why does it matter now?
Thank you for having me, Philip. Very excited to be here with you. So green industrialization for me essentially means an opportunity to build new sustainable industrial clusters that have a competitive advantage versus groupings of industries that, of course, are emitting a lot of carbon. And so, especially from an African perspective, we don't necessarily have very large industrial clusters. It's not really just about reducing the carbon emissions or decarbonizing hard-to-abate sectors. Instead, for me, it's a lease of new life and, of course, hope and inspiration for African countries that want to build new economic opportunities. So for us, it's really a new lease of life and an absolute important opportunity for socio-economic emancipation for people on the continent.
And what's the boldest bet that you made in the last 5 years?
Well, if I reflect on it, without a doubt, it's probably the decision to leave private sector, where I was a very comfortable senior executive running one of Namibia's largest asset managers, and of course, joining government. At the time I did that, I told my wife we're taking on a 3 to 4 year MBA because we ended up taking quite a significant pay cut to join. And we knew we were going to learn a lot and be humbled. And we were hoping to be able to utilize that experience later on to serve Namibia, the continent, and our family. And that's roughly what we're going through right now.
And you also took on a quite big project when you started in the public sector, right? Could you tell us a little bit about this?
Sure. So when I joined in September 2020. I was at the time the economic advisor to the head of state of Namibia. And of course, the president had actually hired about 10 of us before to put together a new economic plan for Namibia. So we were called the high-level panel on the Namibian economy. We gave him a report in March 2020. And of course, in May or June, a few of us got a phone call where he asked us to join. One of us became the central bank governor, one the head of the investment promotion agency, and I was asked to become his personal economic advisor. Immediately after that, when we were trying to put in place new economic opportunities for Namibia, it became to me quite apparent that trying to create new green hydrogen molecules in Namibia could be a very interesting economic sector for our country. We then convinced our president, working together with him, that this could be a priority sector. And the rest, as they say, is history, because it made it into his socio-economic manifesto. And then we went on a very interesting, wild tour from there on to create, I think, the economic clusters that we're building today.
And how did you go about this? How did you convince everybody that this is not just idealism, but really a vision that also has a good economic impact for the country?
Sure. I mean, to be honest, at the time, I really was coming from the background of being an economic analyst, right? Or at least an investment analyst in an asset management firm. So I was quite accustomed to, I suppose, doing a lot of research. So when we joined at the presidency, we were able to work with some private sector players, and we mobilized 3 Bloomberg terminals from the presidency. And when, it was a developer from Australia approached us and said, look, Namibia is a perfect place to build large-scale green hydrogen projects. We conducted in-depth research, for 3 or 4 months, trying to understand what the sector could bring, who the key players are, the sort of finance that it could unlock. And so by the time we had launched the Harambee Prosperity Plan, which was his socio-economic manifesto in March, we understood, I think, the opportunity in a lot of depth. And then, of course, from that point on, we embarked on quite an interesting, I would call, economic diplomatic tour. And very quickly, we unlocked a lot of interest from players from around the world. That quickly became a lot of FDI. And today, as we sit in Namibia, we do have some functioning projects that are actually looking to start selling products around Namibia. So at least for us in Namibia today versus 2021, we've got brick and mortar, we've got investors. It's not a theory anymore, and it's hard to sort of deny the opportunity that this particular molecule presents to industrial clusters in Namibia.
And what potential do you see in hydrogen particularly?
Well, when I try to explain to sort of the average Joe what hydrogen really means, I try sometimes to compare it to sugar, right? And people always say to me, is it because you think hydrogen is very sweet? And I'm like, no. But essentially, a clean hydrogen molecule is a molecule just made from renewable energy using an electrolyzer to split water. But once you have hydrogen, it can become a co-ingredient to make very different products, right? So sugar can be used to make anything from cupcakes to pancakes to wedding cakes, all the way to sweetening tea and making, fizzy drinks, right? Hydrogen is as versatile. You can use hydrogen to make clean fertilizer, shipping fuel, aviation fuel, all the way to using it as a strategic ingredient to reduce iron ore and make a strategic input for clean steel, right? So the other thing about hydrogen is you can, just like sugar, it can be an artificial sweetener, it can be a natural sort of sugar that you can find in fruit. So you can use hydrogen from, oil, right? Essentially hydrocarbons, and then use steam methane reforming to produce hydrogen. They call that gray hydrogen. And at the same time, you can sort of use synthetic hydrogen, which is using clean electricity, right? And then using electrolysis to split a water molecule. So that hydrogen is, in our view, a little bit more manufactured, I suppose, but it has a low carbon signature and therefore can be used to make competitive goods. So we think it's strategic because at the end of the day, we may trade hydrogen, but actually we're beginning to trade many different things that are made using this clean hydrogen.
And could you talk a little bit about this green industrialization plan that you have come up with and that you're now implementing? What does it actually entail? It's a super ambitious project, right?
No, without a doubt. So, we kind of realized that Namibia has some interesting strategic advantages, right? So it is the second least densely populated country in the world. We're basically 3 million people that occupy a country, the size of, 1.5 Germany's, but the population is like less than Berlin's population, right? So there's definitely space to put together large-scale renewable energy projects. We have some of the best solar irradiance in the world, DNI, direct natural irradiation, and at the same time, we have some of the best wind resources. And then we have a 1,000-kilometer coastline. That means we can build these projects, use a lot of clean energy, create the molecules, and then use our coastline to export. Now, to build the sort of projects that we were thinking of at the specific scale, we would need to mobilize a lot of capital to build specific infrastructure. And of course, if we're deploying this renewable energy at very large scale, we can actually attract new industries to Namibia, because sometimes it's very complicated or expensive to transport this clean energy from Namibia to existing industrial clusters elsewhere. So if we were trying to move this hydrogen from, Lüderitz in Namibia all the way to Duisburg in Germany to decarbonize their steel production plant, that would be an expensive endeavor. So what if we actually made the hydrogen in Namibia and then put together a new industrial cluster that will reduce iron, right, and create direct reduced iron ore, and then use that DRI to make green steel, either in Namibia or South Africa. So then you're transporting the DRI versus a hydrogen. Now, once you start to realize that, you start to layer on strategic infrastructure next to each other, ports, transmission lines, pipelines, etc. And at the same time, you start layering on new industries, like we could fabricate some wind turbines if we're deploying them at scale. We could do ammonia plants, maybe methanol, maybe DRI. And within that ecosystem, you end up with an economic plan that could be a significant mover of Namibia's economic makeup. And this is now roughly what we're doing. We put all of this in a blueprint we called Namibia's Green Industrialization Blueprint. There's a roadmap in that blueprint. And today we're now busy executing that roadmap in order to bring everything that I just described to life.
And what did it take to create such a bold proposal in the public sector?
A small hint of madness, a lot of vision, and of course, a very inspirational leader, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, our late president, his name was Dr. Hage G. Geingob. He passed on the 4th of February, 2024. He was always a very intellectually curious, I think, person, right? And so, when he hired me, I think I was like 35 years old. He was almost 80. And so you can imagine, here I am trying to tell him about something as dynamic as green hydrogen. Most people would have probably said it's too risky, we should shelve it. But really on his end, he took it on with so much curiosity and he said we should go for it. And so I think that bold visionary leadership from him right at the top as president made a huge difference, because we then after that organized cabinet around this. We organized a lot of our society. So we put together a Namibian Green Hydrogen Association to organize private sector, a Green Hydrogen Council, a bunch of ministers to organize government, and then Namibian Green Hydrogen Research Institute, where we organize academia around this concept. And then we pursued it with fervor and great guidance and leadership. And of course, that made us stand out, right? No one else was doing it that, certainly not in Africa with that level of conviction. And that really did make Namibia stand out. And on the back of that, we were able to mobilize something like 120 million euros of grant funding in 3 or 4 years, about $895 million in sort of capital commitments at 26% of the typical cost of capital that we would incur when we are trying to raise that sort of money as Namibia. So it was really that really visionary leadership from him that helped the world and Namibia gather around this concept and set us off on a very, very interesting journey.
And how can companies or organizations be involved in this project that you're building now?
Sure. And I mean, that's a very broad question, right? Because today we have companies from all over, right? Namibian companies and organizations from around the world. So we're working with the World Bank, Climate Investment Funds, African Development Bank to try and mobilize what we're calling fit for purpose capital, concessionary climate related capital that really makes the goods that we'll make in Namibia competitive. We're working with our tertiary institutions in Namibia and others from Belgium and Netherlands to put together a skills development strategy and plan. At the same time, we're working with international legislative drafters and local legislative drafters to put together a new policy and pieces of legislation for our government. And at the same time, we're also working with various R&D centers from around the world and consultancies like Fraunhofer and Finchner to do R&D on cutting edge technology that we would like to deploy from Namibia first. So what we've seen is, because we had organized our government, private sector, and academia, we've been able to have a very broad range of engagements with the world and also with the region. And that is making the Namibian ecosystem around green industrialization very, very, very rich. To give you an idea, we had issued a few green hydrogen scholarships, about 180 to date. And a lot of those students have now come together and formed something called the Youth for Green Hydrogen, essentially Research Institute. And they are now partnering with the Namibian Green Hydrogen Program to start doing very specific cutting edge research with the projects in Namibia on how to start looking at innovative pieces of technology around this particular ecosystem. So stuff like that has been very inspiring, and we're getting companies from around the world trying to participate in such a dialogue.
So Namibia is really building now a low carbon industry economy at scale and very quickly. What can other countries learn from this? Is there other parts of the models that can be replicated?
To be honest, across the continent, for example, there's something called the African Green Hydrogen Alliance. Mauritania, Egypt, Morocco, Kenya, South Africa, Namibia are just some of the members, right? And each of those members has their own strategic strength, but some of those strengths are also fairly common, right? Each of them are typically coast-based countries because you're going to have to export a lot of these products. They each have above average, sources of wind and solar and sort of really good renewable energy. Of course, they've each by now developed a hydrogen strategy and so on and so forth. So those are all ingredients one can each, sort of replicate, right? You do need very strong leadership and very strong a collective sort of pursuit of this objective by government. Some of the things that are more unique, though, is Namibia is quite a small country. And so, compared to South Africa, we're a $13 billion economy there, almost $450 billion economy. The size might make South Africa look more attractive, but for some people, Namibia is small, but it also means it's nimble, right? So to get decisions through cabinet or through government might be easier or quicker than, for example, to get decisions through maybe the South African or the Egyptian sort of cabinet. At the same time, Namibia doesn't have an industrial cluster that needs to be disrupted, right? So there's just a lot of upside risk, whereas South Africa, Egypt, and some of the larger economies have very large industrial clusters, many of which are carbon intensive. And so they need to be decarbonized, which means transformation, which means disruption, which means a certain amount of pain, right, that you have to go through. Whereas with Namibia, very little downside risk. It's all about building from scratch. One downside of that is one could argue, does this small country have the ability to build large, complex projects, right? Because it hasn't done it before. So you can see, Philip, each country would have its own unique strengths and weaknesses, and you have to model your approach around your particular strengths and weaknesses, coupled with who your typical trading partners, where does your FDI normally come from, and then try to put together a strategy that works for you. And this is something that here at the Namibian Green Hydrogen Program, we have learned, and we might actually try to share with the rest of the continent by launching something we're calling the African Sustainable Industrialization Institute.
So you talked about the strength of Namibia. So it's quite impressive to see, how much you moved from strategy to execution. Many can actually come up with a strategy. Few can actually also deliver on it. So how did you go about the execution of this project?
I think, to be honest, one of the biggest things that was a big differentiator was very quickly at the presidency, we obviously had our visionary leader who had a small team of advisors around him, right? So at least there was, apart from the rest of government, there was a very handful of focused people, right, that were really looking at delivering this particular vision at speed. Very quickly, we were able to organize resources from our private sector and from some of our development partners from around the world, like Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, the EU Commission, etc., even Japan. And we then very quickly put together a strategy with the help of, key sort of consultants like McKinsey, Systemic, and others. And one of the strategic things we put in the Namibian Green Hydrogen Strategy was that we needed to form what we're calling today a Green Hydrogen Program, but at the time we called an Implementation Authority Office. So to give you an idea, today I lead a group of 17 professionals that are multidisciplinary in nature. We have lawyers here, financial expert, skills development experts, engineers, electrical engineers, civil engineers, and the works. And our sole focus is on trying to create a conducive ecosystem for these projects to thrive in Namibia. So we're helping government with putting in place various tax incentives, helping governments conduct strategic environmental and social assessments, and at the same time, looking at the various projects, interviewing them, and understanding what sort of skills do they need, and then feeding that into a Minister of Education to make sure our curriculum and our tertiary and vocational institutions are prepared to provide the sort of labor that's needed. So all of that strategic work is being done by a concerted group of experts that are solely focused on unlocking and enabling green industrialization. And I think that particular focus has been a big differentiator between amazing speeches saying we want to do green industrialization and capacity and capability on the ground that allows for rapid problem solving and also iterative problem solving, getting feedback from the industry, passing that across to government, and then trying to be responsive as well to, of course, a morphing and changing and dynamic geopolitical space, which of course means the sort of exuberance for green hydrogen in 2021, 2022 is not there today. And so how do you then dynamically as well respond from your economic diplomatic efforts to make sure that what is at the core an international trade agenda is still relevant in today's sort of geopolitical space as well?
So you talked about diversity of talent and actually getting them to work together. I imagine that it's also very difficult to have like political actors, private sector actors working together. Do you have any secret sauce, any things that we can learn from your actions there?
Yeah, there is no secret source. It doesn't work. Yeah. It's there's this term herding cats, right? So
Mhm.
it's difficult, right? And why is it difficult? It's because each of them have sort of a different portfolio of fickle stakeholders with different time zones, right? Private sector players have shareholders that require returns immediately. Politicians typically get, re-elected every 4 to 5 years. Economic cycle worsen the realities of both of those stakeholders. Namibia, of course, has a high level of unemployment, so our sort of government can be very skewed towards what could we do for the people, versus private sector that might want something to be done for the corporates and the shareholders. So it's difficult. However, one of the things I think that was genius in what the president did do is he hired a bunch of private sector investment orientated people, including myself and others. I was a CFA charter holder in my past. I deployed capital into companies and judged those companies on their ability to use that capital to maximize return for shareholders and providers of capital in general, right? So at least I understood what the private sector players wanted. Having spent a lot of time with him, he coached me a lot on what do politicians want, what do the electorates want. And once we were able to start marrying those two, that overlap, when the two Venn diagrams come together, once you start understanding that common language, it was really magical. And I can give you a practical example. So we put together a fund called the SDG Namibia One Fund, which is essentially a public sector sponsored fund. The Dutch government put in a lot of money. The Namibian government supported it, etc. And so it was a public sector sponsored fund that was supposed to provide cheap concessional capital and grants to develop these projects in Namibia. So it was public sector helping private sector, but using typical private equity. So a typical private sector vehicle to get public sector capital into private sector hands. And doing that in that manner created a lot of confidence from the private sector and providers of capital. And so, that was one of the examples of those sweet spots where we got governments to behave a little bit like private sector. And some of the incentives in there, also spoke to the aspirations of ministers of both governments. And it was a very innovative, I think, approach. South Africa is now trying to do something similar, etc. So it's difficult to get them going, but if you do get the two of them to come together, it can be quite transformative.
You talked about many countries in Africa actually mimicking this kind of green transformation, green industrialization approach. What do you think will the role of this green industrialization play for Africa's position in the new global order that is currently being developed?
Sure. I mean, I think what's very important is, a lot of people would perceive Africa to be, an exporter of raw minerals that, typically get used to add value or create new products somewhere else. And then sometimes a lot of those products are imported back into the continent. And I think green industrialization poses a real opportunity to turn that equation around. I know a very good friend of mine, Mr. Paddy Panamathan, who's building a project called X-Links that tries to connect renewable energy production in Morocco and sort of sell that energy in the UK. And he was talking to climate parliamentarians the other day that I was also addressing, and he was noting that, there is a lot of clean energy on the continent that, yes, can get sent to the UK. But at the same time, once you start to learn how to harness that clean energy and use it in your own country, a lot of those industrial clusters actually will be transferred back into the continent, not even back, but can come into the continent. And he was noting how the cost of energy for that particular renewable energy project he was building would be something like 7 to 10, I think, dollars a megawatt hour or something like that in the UK. 7 to 8 actually. Whereas the truth used to be that long time ago, before the gas crisis, those were the sort of prices the UK were enjoying, but today they're paying 10 to 12, maybe even up to 14. And Morocco used to pay that sort of price for energy in Morocco, but now they could enjoy, electricity at 7, even less dollars a megawatt hour because of the declining costs of renewable energy, especially driven by solar. So you can imagine in such an instance, African nations that have this plethora of renewable energy at low cost can really sort of use this energy to build a whole new fortune. Twofold. One, because we start to become a producer of their energy itself, which can be, of course, valuable. But at the same time, we can use that energy at home without having to transport it to create new industrial clusters. One small thing to note. So trading in electrons is one thing, but remember, oil and gas is typically hydrocarbons, they're typically molecules. And those normally is what you will move around the world to create or to feed industrial clusters. And with hydrocarbons, oil and gas, there are only a few countries in the world that have very rich, economically viable deposits. Whereas with these electrons, these synthetic electrons or these clean electrons and the synthetic fuels, it's a lot more democratically dispersed around the world. And so all of a sudden, you're actually almost leveling the playing field of potentially being able to build new industrial clusters, which I think is a very interesting and novel idea for all of us to meditate on as well.
Very true. And a lot of potential. So thinking about this potential, what do you think is the vision for Namibia 10 years in the future?
Oh, we have to be super practical. So in Namibia, for us, the vision 10 years from today it's a vision of scale, Philip, right? We went from dreaming in 2021 to proving it's doable in 2024, 2025 at small scale. So we've got 3 or 4 pilot projects operating, built by Namibians, producing new novel products, whether it's ammonia, they're beginning to produce direct reduced iron ore, they've produced hydrogen already. So we know it can be done. The key leap now is, can it be done at scale? So go from 25 megawatts of solar powering 12 megawatts of electrolyzer to produce 15,000 tons of DRI a year, to 250 megawatts, using 300 megawatts of batteries to produce 200,000 tons of direct reduced iron ore. And we want to start that journey in December 2025, right? After that, in 2028, we'll increase the scale 10x. So by 10 years from now, 2035, I would have loved for us to have built at least phase 3 of high iron, right? Zero should be up and running. We should be trading these molecules around the world. And ideally, as an ex-economic advisor to the president, some of those key statistics that we wanted to change are now moving in the right direction. Unemployment is not at 37% anymore. It's lower. The level of our Gini coefficient, our inequality in the country, I think today we're the second highest unequal country in the world. That is moving in the right direction. And then most importantly, the level of economic complexity in the country, the sort of goods that we make, the sort of goods that we trade, have increased in complexity from primarily a primary sector oriented economy that trades in gold, diamonds, sort of meat, those sort of products, to products that are more manufactured, more secondary sector in nature. So we're trading a lot more electricity, not buying, but we're selling. We're trading in clean fuels and biofuels, and we're trading in minerals that have been value added right here at home. And we're also importing minerals from other African countries, adding value to them in Namibia and creating wealth within the African continent, using the African Continental Free Trade Area as a real economic opportunity. That's where I want us to be in 10 years, and I'm quietly confident we'll get there.
Exciting vision. James, in the beginning, you talked about the boldest thing that you've done in the last 5 years, which was basically making the move from private to public sector. Why did you do this? What fascinated you about the government?
I think most of my friends and colleagues ask me this all the time. To be honest, I can't take the credit for that myself.
Mm,
Like I said, after we did the work of the high level panel, I got a phone call. And, at the time it came from the presidency, and they said, would you want to join government, right? And
mhm,
I said, well, what does it entail? They described it. And a big part of that was a 78% pay cut, right? So I took that home, and my wife said, you must be crazy. I returned that message, and then they said to me one thing. They said, so if you don't want to do it, please tell us who will, right? Give us a
mm,
name of somebody else that we think should take your place. I think the proud, competitive person in me couldn't come up with another name. So, after another conversation with the family, we decided to do it. But really, it was a very bold and very visionary leader in our ex-president, who, I was humbled that he was even asking me to help him, right? He's been in
mhm,
politics for almost 60 years at that point in time.
mhm,
And for him to have asked me for my help, it was an easy yes from a big part of me.
mhm,
And to be honest, I don't regret the decision at all, because the vision, my own perspective, the experience I've gained, the networks I've built around the world I could never have achieved that, I think, on my own.
mhm.
And so I'm eternally grateful to him and the Namibian government for giving us the opportunity. And yeah, it's been the most fantastic, wildest ride of my life so far, for sure.
Can imagine. So was there something that you had to unlearn? Because it's quite a different scale that you operate in the private sector versus public sector, right?
Yeah. So to be honest with you, Philip, it's been a very humbling experience, right? So the stakeholders in the public sector are not as forgiving, right? In the private sector, maybe you're operating amongst a fairly rational bunch of people. Customers will be happy if the products are good. Employers will be happy if you make some money for them. And your colleagues will be fairly happy if you're a fairly nice collegial guy to work with, right? In the public sector, politics can be unforgiving, right? So I think one of the biggest things I had to do was learning how to put on a thick skin every day as part of my clothing when I went to work, right? Because political parties and opposition and the general public, they don't sometimes really just judge you from your output, right? They judge you from all sorts of characteristics, your skin color, how you sound, what you say,
Mhm,
which political party they think you're from. Very tough thing for me to do. And for somebody who I suppose I used to get enough gratification, right, from providing good solutions for my clients, I had to unlearn needing gratification from others, right? And rather try
mhm,
to focus on the work that you're doing objectively, and whether it's really making a difference. And I also had to unlearn getting satisfaction or um, measuring progress on short-term things, right? So, for example,
mhm,
the first direct reduced iron ore got produced in April 2025, but we launched this vision in March 2021. So what happened in between, right? Like a lot of doubt, a lot of criticism. And so being long-term focused is something that I also had to learn. But yeah, at the moment, I'm still learning, to be honest with you. I'm still journaling a lot of what the past 4 years have been. Absolutely.
mhm. And is there some advice that you would give to somebody trying or thinking about the same leap?
I would advise them to think very hard about what they want to achieve, right? I was in a point in my career where I did want a diverse experience. I had a very good relationship with our ex-president, so I admired the person etc. So think hard about why you're doing it.
Mhm,
The second is definitely make sure you're taking your family along for the ride. In fact,
mhm,
one of my friends, who's a young global leader, a World Economic Forum young global leader from Singapore, was going through a similar discussion. And one of the things I told him was spend a long, hard time talking to your family. So your spouse their lives get, well, for me anyway, because it was a very tough work schedule, they will, get to see you in the public eye, sometimes not always positively. They have to do a lot of the family rearing because you're always traveling. So I had to, I had to really spend a good amount of time with my spouse and then your kids as well, because they won't always see you at home. And then lastly, make sure that your balance sheet and your financial affairs are in order, right? Because if you're not, when you take on, say, an MBA at Harvard, right? If you don't have a scholarship, it's $96,000 for 2 years, right? And your balance sheet needs to be able to absorb that. And when you come back, sometimes you have a lot of debt, and then you have to try and monetize that experience to pay back your debt. Public sector can be similar, right? Your income can be significantly reduced. So if your lifestyle was not flexible, you could have a very, very uncomfortable ride. And so I had done a lot of that reorganizing early on, and it was a bit easier. It was still a shock though, right? When I actually finally got there. People should be looking at their balance sheets and making sure they can sustain 3 or 4 years of very humble earnings, depending on, of course, where you're coming from an earnings perspective. I think that's what I would advise, Philip. And maybe one more thing. Make sure you know about, and this is something I wasn't very familiar with, the philosophical underpinnings of the party that you're going to be working for. So whoever's in power at that point in time when you're working in government, because sometimes that philosophical underpinning drives a lot of the ambition and the rationale. And if you're not familiar with that and you're just looking at things from a scientific or a financial perspective, it can be a massive culture shock as well.
Great advice, I think. Gives everybody a lot to think about, for sure. James, there's one last question I want to ask you. In fact, a question that we ask to everybody that joins this show, and that is, what makes you optimistic about the future?
So for me, I think what makes me optimistic about the future is, we dreamt of something hard to do. We've done it, right? And what has happened is a lot of Namibians are now way more confident about their own ability to do something that's globally unique, like a world's first. And I think that's fantastic. When I see the tingle in the eye of a lot of the young Namibians who are applying for, green hydrogen scholarships, or they're looking to get involved in new projects, or even to do R&D in academia, it's really, really inspiring. Here at the program, we are very excited about putting together this new African Sustainable Industrialization Institute. We really do think that we have a lot to add in terms of helping African governments with policy development and strategy development. And at the same time, given a lot of our backgrounds and our strengths, we think we have a very unique opportunity to mobilize fit-for-purpose capital into countries that adopt this thinking and this philosophy. And I think, that to us goes beyond just sort of aspiring to do something and putting together strategies, but actually to deploy hard-earned cash into these economies and seeing projects being built and new products being developed will be extremely satisfying. And I think those two things make me very optimistic for the future, because so far, the few people that we have shared this idea of an African Sustainable Industrialization Institute, a lot of them are quite excited. And of course, the best thing for us is we're not trying to do this alone. We're partnering with some of the largest asset managers on the continent, governments around the continent, and of course, multilateral development finance institutions from around the continent to try and coalesce folks who are aligned to try and put together symbiotic relationships and leverage a new economic future for the continent that actually hasn't been done before. And that in itself is quite exciting and makes me look forward to the future, especially as somebody who's a father to a 6-year-old and a 20-year-old, right? Trying to build a future for them, or at least a prosperous globe for them, when prosperity is not just measured in financial terms, but also in ecological terms and in social inclusive terms, is something that excites me very much.
James, thank you very much for joining us today on What's Next, and for giving us so much to think about, and for sharing this bold vision for green industrialization, and actually how companies and countries can compete in the green economy. And to all of our listeners, stay curious and join us next time on What's Next.